Just give it another 10, 15 seconds and we'll get started. All right. Welcome to the Quincy Institute's panel discussion titled, Who's Behind Instability in the Middle East? My name is Trita Parsi. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Quincy Institute, which is a think tank in Washington that promotes ideas that move US foreign policy away from endless war and toward vigorous diplomacy. We favor a national security strategy that is centered on military restraint and diplomacy. The Middle East has suffered immensely from civil wars, especially in the decade following the Arab Spring. Hundreds of thousands of people have died, millions have fled from their homes, and untold numbers have been subjected to poverty and repression in places from Libya to Syria to Iraq and Yemen. US policy throughout this period, but also in the decades prior to that, have been organized around the idea that the chaos is the result of the malign activities of a single boogeyman. Sometimes it's Saddam Hussein, other times it's Muammar Gaddafi, Assad in Syria, or the theocracy in Iran. But a new paper by the Quincy Institute, No Clean Hands, the Interventionist of Middle East Powers, 2010 to 2020, suggests that the picture is quite a bit more complicated than that rather cartoonish image. There are 6 states in the Middle East that are roughly equally interventionist in terms of military interventions. And there are actually no outliers. 5 of the 6 are actually armed and politically supported by the United States. And these partners of the United States have fought each other as much as they have been fighting US rivals. How will or should this picture impact US policy, assuming that stability is viewed as being conducive to US interests in the region? Could a different approach help stabilize the region and better protect US interests in the Middle East, while also creating the circumstances that would allow the peoples of the Middle East to pursue the political change of their own preference? To address these important questions, we have an excellent panel with 3 prominent experts in the field. But before I introduce them, let me just remind everyone that if you wish to ask your questions, please put them in the Q&A function in the Zoom, and I will try to get to those questions throughout the conversation. So with no further ado, let's get started. Our first speaker is Matt Petti, who is the lead author of the aforementioned report. He is a reporter at Responsible Statecraft and a researcher at the Quincy Institute. He is also a 2023 Fulbright Fellow. He was previously a national security reporter at the National Interest. Professor Monica Duffy-Toft is a non-resident fellow at the Quincy Institute and professor of international relations and politics at the Tufts University's Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. Prior to that, she was professor of government at Oxford University, as well as at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. She has written extensively on military interventions. And last but not least, we have Dr. Shadi Hamid, who is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, a contributing writer at The Atlantic, and co-founder and editor of Wisdom of Crowds. He's the author of Islamic Exceptionalism, How the Struggle Over Islam is Reshaping the World. In 2019, he was also named one of the world's top 50 thinkers by Prospect magazine. His forthcoming book, The Problem of Democracy, America, the Middle East, and the Rise and Fall of an Idea, will be published by Oxford University Press in 2022. So let's get started. Matt, could you just give us a 3 to 4 minute overview of the paper, its findings, and also perhaps a little bit of how this study was conducted?
Great. So as Trita mentioned, I think Americans love kind of a heroes and villains Hollywood story, particularly in the Middle East. We've always tried to fed this image that there is some kind of villain who, if there's chaos in the region and there's instability, it's the result of some kind of villain who has been exporting it, usually some revolutionary regime. And there's kind of, I think, a countervailing view that's much less influential in circles of power, that some US ally like Saudi Arabia is responsible for most of the chaos in the region. But these debates, and this is the logic, I think, that drove the Iraq War it reached its apex with the Iraq War, and it's also kind of driving the maximum pressure campaign against Iran. But these debates are not really informed with empirical data. Nobody's really looked side by side at different countries in the Middle East and how much they intervene. So we created a methodology that kind of codes different types of interventions, armed interventions in civil wars and other conflicts, and compared different countries' intervention over time. What we found is the picture is a little bit more complicated. There were some years when, and we looked at the decade of the Arab Spring, so 2011, right before the revolutions, up until 2020. We found that, yes, in some years, Iran was the most interventionist power. In other years, it was surpassed by US allies and partners. And in fact, the lion's share of interventions in the regions were done by US allies and partners because US allies and the US is backing most of the countries in the region, most of the major powers in the region. And furthermore, a lot of these powers are converging on similar methods. We hear a lot about, malign activities, proxy warfare, etc. But the Iranians, the Turks, the Emiratis, and the Saudis all have kind of a similar model. We don't call it, malign activity or proxy warfare as much when the Emiratis do it, but, just like the Iranians have brought mercenaries and people from all these different conflict zones into Syria, the Emiratis have done so in Yemen, with a lot of times with Saudi money. They've brought Sudanese fighters, Colombian fighters. They've done the same thing in Libya with the addition of Russian Wagner Group mercenaries. And the Turks, I think, were relatively recent additions to this game, but they've also, cultivated the Syrian National Army, which, by the way, elements of it were just sanctioned by the US Treasury this morning. But they've cultivated elements of the Syrian National Army to use as mercenaries in Libya, Azerbaijan. There's rumors, I don't know how reliable they are, that they might bring them to Afghanistan. What's more is that a lot of these methods seem to have been influenced by the US. The Turks developed their drone program, which they've used extensively in their proxy wars after looking at the effectiveness of US and Israeli drones. The Emiratis actually hired Eric Prince to train and manage their proxy forces. And although this is a less of a direct connection, I mean, there's kind of an uncanny resemblance between the way that the Iranians have used civilian airlines to move men and material and the way the CIA created this front airline, Air America, in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. All of these, what's more is that, a lot of the intervention and escalation happening in the region is not between US allies and partners and these kind of malign actors that are US enemies. Oftentimes it's between US allies and partners. I think the most underrated development of the past 10 years has been the kind of Cold War between these two blocs. There's not really a good name for them, but you have the kind of Emirates and Saudi Arabia on one side and Qatar and Turkey on the other side. You've seen this kind of happen in Egypt, very much in a very kinetic and violent way in Libya, and the Qatar crisis. And in many cases, the US has actually, encouraged this. The Trump administration egged on the Saudi blockade of Qatar pretty much, according to the Intercept reports, pretty much up until the point when the Saudis were threatening a military invasion, and then we, pulled back. They kind of, the Obama administration kind of gave benign neglect to the Emirati intervention in Libya against Qatari-backed forces. And there was the Saudi-Israeli pressure campaign reportedly that Jared Kushner encouraged that kind of culminated in this weirdness happening in Jordan very recently. Some say a coup attempt. So I think this actually does leave some room for optimism, though, because if the US is backing so many of these regional powers and so much of the fighting is between US partners and allies, that means that the US has diplomatic leverage to reduce tensions in the region, to tell people to knock it off, stop interfering in other people's civil wars. This isn't going to solve all the region's problems, and we can't control all the behavior of our allies and partners, but we certainly have a lot more leverage than if all of the instability was coming from our enemies who, we have much less of a chance to influence their behavior. And finally, an insight of this is that while foreign intervention often prolonged, worsened, made civil wars much more brutal, it usually didn't start civil wars. Usually what happened is you have state collapse and then intervention followed in a dynamic that very much follows how arms race happen. We call this in international relations studies the security dilemma. A civil war happens, one country makes what it believes to be a defensive move by backing forces to defend its own interests. Other countries see that as an offensive move and then launch their own interventions, get their own proxy forces, which then sparks the original country and all of its neighbors to take that as offensive moves. And you have this kind of spiral building up. Again, the spark of this is state collapse, usually are often starting with local factors inside the country, poor governance, authoritarian regimes, brutal repression, but oftentimes it's been encouraged by US military action. I mean, the Iraq War is kind of the example of that. And I think it had far-reaching effects on state stability outside of Iraq, where the US military basically destroyed a state and then tried to unsuccessfully create a new order and kind of left this flaming wreckage there, which became a battleground for different states and non-state actors to build their interventions in. And so that leads to a final kind of insight is perhaps an axiom guiding US foreign policy should be to do no harm. Now, that doesn't mean to never act in the rest of the world ever, but before we can think about improving things, we need to make sure that we're not inflaming situations and undermining the kind of stable, peaceful conditions that are necessary for true democratic revolutions.
Thank you so much, Matt. Yeah, it seems to be in many ways contradicting many of the principles and the axioms that tend to be dominated here in Washington. Shadi, you have written extensively on this. I think you have more of a positive view on the use of military force by the United States in the region for good. On Twitter, as you were kindly promoting the seminar, you said that there's both agreements and disagreements with the paper. Why don't you start with a disagreement?
Okay, thanks, Trita, for having me. I'll try my best to play my role as the token interventionist on the panel. But what's interesting, I think, is that there is quite a bit of agreement. I don't want to dwell on that too much because it's maybe not as interesting. But I would say, from my perspective, a lot of the diagnosis in Matthew's talk and also in your paper is correct, that we as Americans have the misfortune of having bad allies in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, so on and so forth. And I think it is worth really emphasizing that it's not just Iran, that the countries that we are ostensibly partners with cause instability and are quite brutal and repressive to their own populations as well as to populations abroad. Where I disagree is on what to do about that. And so if we have this misfortune of bad allies, then that actually has the implication that the US has to be more involved in the Middle East in order to restrain our bad allies. If we as Americans take a step back and we say, let's disengage, let's do no harm, so on and so forth, that actually creates the very vacuum that invites countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, Turkey, and Qatar to be more aggressive, to fund more proxy warfare. And I think this is one of the tragedies of the Obama era, that as Obama stepped back from the Middle East as part of his desire to pivot, and which didn't really work, but that was Obama's intent. And it actually led to a situation where Saudi Arabia and others decided to become more aggressive and more muscular in their foreign policy. It's interesting, Matthew, that Matthew mentioned the point here of leverage. And we do have leverage to put pressure on our allies to be better or to at least be less bad. But that would require a more engaged approach. Contrary to what we're seeing now with the Biden administration, the Biden team doesn't seem very interested in the Middle East. They see it primarily as a nuisance. My argument would be that the only way to address these sources of instability in the region is for the US to prioritize human rights and democracy, using economic conditionality, and specifically conditionality on military aid to pressure our allies to act more constructively. But that, I think, is a little bit in tension with the do no harm approach, because I think oftentimes when people hear do no harm, they say, okay, let's not actually do too much. Let's not be too active. Let's focus on other regions. The US has a tragic history in the Middle East, as I think most of us agree on. So that means taking a step back. My argument is that it requires taking a step towards the Middle East and re-engaging. That doesn't necessarily mean using military force. As some of you may know, I supported military action against the Assad regime, and we don't have to get into that right now, but it might come up later in our conversation. I think I'll just say one last thing on Libya, since that was one of the cases that Matthew mentioned. Libya, I think, is a case that doesn't fit neatly into the analysis. That the civil war, I would argue, was a result of the Obama administration washing its hands of Libya. That after the NATO intervention, the US didn't want to help Libya rebuild and didn't encourage its European partners. And there's some blame to be had here on the side of the EU and EU member states. But we can't draw a direct line from the NATO intervention to the problems that we see in Libya today, the civil war that is ongoing. I would say it's a lack of follow-up after the initial intervention, which is an important part of the story. So if we do intervene to stop mass slaughter, which I'm very much a proponent of, that if we actually see Gaddafi's forces marching to Benghazi and they're about to commit large-scale mass killings, I think there is a moral imperative to stop that killing if we are able to do so. But that doesn't mean we disappear from Libya right after Gaddafi is gone and say we're going to leave Libyans to their own devices. And the final point is that Matthew, and also I think in the paper more broadly, I very much do agree that state failure is a big driver of instability in the region, but we have to ask, what are the roots of that state failure or state collapse? And from my standpoint, I would maybe emphasize more that authoritarianism is the primary driver of instability, that if regimes are brutally repressing their own people, that makes resistance movements or armed rebellion more likely. That to me was the original sin in Syria, not US intervention or the lack thereof from my perspective, but actually the fact that the Assad regime was killing its own people. So if we identify that as a major driver of instability, the question is, how does the US reduce authoritarianism or try to counter authoritarian regimes in the region? And unfortunately, whether we like it or not, I think that means that we have to be more engaged by putting more pressure on our allies.
Thank you so much, Shadi. This was a lot of very interesting points. I'm sure we're going to get back to Libya. I want to give Monica an opportunity to come in with some of her comments, but I would also like you to perhaps address some of the points that Shadi mentioned. One quick thing for myself, if I may use the prerogative of the chair. I find it very interesting what you said, Shadi, in regards to whether this actually calls for greater involvement in the Middle East. I think there might be a fallacy there, though, because doing no harm does not mean continue to sell all these weapons to these countries, continue to support them politically when they do those things, and then do no harm. No, do no harm actually means stop doing all of those things. So it's not some sort of a laissez-faire approach of just letting it be as it is, status quo, in which we actually are actively supporting a lot of these different activities. But Monica, love to get your thoughts, both on the paper you've written extensively on interventionism, but also perhaps if you have an opportunity to address some of the points that Shadi mentioned.
So thanks for having me, and I think it's a terrific report. As you know, I'm a data junkie, so I think data, we have a baseline in which we can sort of make our arguments, and I think you guys did a terrific job trying to come up with data so that you could substantiate some of the claims that are out there, the conventional wisdoms about sort of the villains and the heroes. And as you say, the title of it is No Clean Hands. There are no heroes in this story, actually, maybe the human rights advocates, as Shadi is alluding to, but beyond that, there doesn't seem to be any clean hands. So I think the data are great. I really like that you tease through the different kinds of interventions and the reasons why the states are doing it. So although they're allies with the US in some cases, in most cases of the cases that you talk about, their interests don't necessarily align with ours, with the United States. And, you know, as you know, we're collecting these data of all US military interventions since 1776. And for the more current period, what's nice is to see that your data align with our data. It's comforting to know that. And that's not surprising given what you found, which is that the United States in the contemporary period, we have found is much more interventionist. And unnervingly, it's not only more interventionist, meaning that it's involved in more engagement, more events, but they're more escalated, right? So they're more escalatory. And interestingly, at a time when our conflictual partners are trying to de-escalate their fights, the United States is escalating and turning to the use of force and more robust use of force. So I put this out there because I think what you've touched upon are broader trends and that the United States is implicated in this. And it's not surprising, we're seeing this globally, that we're not surprising to see this in the Middle East as a region. So that's a really important finding. I like the way you guys pull that out. One thing that I just sort of wanted to quibble with it, and it has to do with the time. So, and Shadi, you already talked about it a little bit and your instability remark. Your data are only looking at from 2010 to 2020, correct? And, you know, there's a lot of history prior to 2010, right, for why we may have an intervention that's happening in 2010 or 2015 or 2020, and sadly continuing on to the coming decades. And so for me, when I was reading it, and I love that you're talking about regional politics, it's very important, and we have not done this kind of analysis within the region, is that the great power game is still happening. And Shadi sort of talked about this with former President Barack Obama, trying to pull back and perhaps allow our European allies to take on through NATO the Libya crisis. It failed for a variety of different reasons. Shadi is much more expert than I am. But I would have liked to have seen a little bit more about great power politics in this report, because Russia, one of the reasons why Syria got as messy and dirty as it did is that Putin, after Barack Obama said it's a regional power, Putin said, we're not a regional power. In fact, we're going to reassert our authority in Syria. So I would have liked to have seen that play out, because as you guys rightly are trying to get us to focus on restraint, right, and look at different regions, we've got an emerging power in China, economically at least, perhaps militarily, that we're also going to have to contend with. And in that case, we may not need restraint or restraint in a different way, whereas in the Middle East. So I would have liked to have seen you guys play around with the great power politics dynamics a little bit more. And that goes back to Shadi's comment about the causality and the instability thing, because your paper, the report, does make the case that the causality issue, that it's interventions that are leading to instability, or no, instability leading to interventions. And I'm not sure I agree with that. I think it's systemic. I think you've got great power politics operating in that region since the discovery of oil. I think you then, and then the colonialization and imperial period. And then you have autocratic regimes that Shadi talks about. And we know autocratic regimes go after each other. This is why the United States is so desperate to hopefully try to help to install democratic regimes, because we know democratic regimes, we believe that they do not go after one another. But in any event, so I think it's more systemic, that they're the causal arrows, and some of my people who trained me in my PhD would hate for me to say this. It's more complicated than that, that the causality, you don't know, it's turtles all the way down. We don't know when to start. When did an event start or end? And I think that it gets you in a little bit of trouble in your argumentation, because of the periodization of your data, which is 2010 to 2020, which is very narrow. So I would have liked, if I had been a reviewer, to say, look, this is what we can say about this period, right? It appears to say that, but actually there's a much deeper and broader history here. And then lastly, I think, because we're going to talk about the United States in particular, and Shadi, you already sort of alluded to this, is that the United States systematically and systemically overestimates its influence, right? The idea that we can go in there and do regime change, we've been trying to do that since the 19th century, early 20th century, right? And the idea that we can go in there and have huge amounts of influence. I think especially in this more contemporary period, after we made such a mash with the Iraq invasion and occupation, and now with the situation in Afghanistan and pulling back, and then still trying to figure out what to do in Iraq. But the point is that as we think about it, I don't want us to have that hubris, element that we are the ones that have the capacity alone, or perhaps in tandem with some of our allies, to make change. Where I would like us to really be on this side of the humility hubris index, to really be humble about what we think we can achieve. Because we've shown, first of all, that we don't learn history. We definitely don't learn the lessons of history. We don't understand that history rhymes, it doesn't repeat, and we constantly get ourselves into trouble. And more importantly, we put that region and other regions of the world in horrific danger and, of course, harm. And so, Shadi, you talk about we want to be better or be less bad. I think we want to start with some introspection, right, as a country, as a nation, about what we have done and what we can possibly do. And I think we want to put an adjective in front of involvement, right? Not just involvement. And Trita, you already talked about this. Stop selling arms, right? So how do we do that, given that the arms industry is so powerful in this country? But we want to think about diplomacy and intelligence, right? We've really let that arm of our of course, the trade as well, but then also the military. But trade and intelligence and diplomacy have really fallen by the wayside. And under the Trump administration, we know that intelligence in particular, it was really given a bad rap, right? It was politicized. And then, of course, the diplomatic corps was gutted, right? I teach at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and my students would ask me, should I go to the State Department, right? It has no more power. The legitimacy is sort of truncated. And I say, please do, because the administrations will change, and we still need our diplomats. And then, of course, in the intelligence, we understand, particularly in this cyber and this kinetic, cyber environment, that intelligence is probably going to be more important when it comes to coercive power. So if we want to be involved and have coercive involvement, it may not be at the pointy end of a gun, right? It more likely that it's going to be thinking through the cyber aspect and sort of control and influence in that way. So again, I think for us to be better or be less bad, I think it starts at home. And I think just to wrap it up, because I think we're going to talk about contemporary politics in the Biden administration, I actually commend what they're doing, because for me, what they're doing is taking stock. They're pulling back. They're going to look at the tools they have, look at the threats, the first, second, third order threats. And I would think about, okay, how can we more properly re-engage? That's how I read the foreign policy, this pulling back. Yes, it's scary, but the evidence seems to indicate that Afghanistan is not going to get better, and that the United States should pull back, and then Iraq will see where it goes. So this taking stock is sort of, for me, as somebody who watches foreign affairs and national security, it's a breath of fresh air, because it's like, all right, this is not working, let's pull back. I don't know what plan B is going to be, or C or D down the road, but this is not working, and maybe we can just take a breath and see and do an assessment of what we might be able to do better down the road.
Thank you so much, Monica. Matt, very quickly, because I want to make sure we get the audience into the conversation as well, but if you could very quickly respond to two of the points that have been raised. On the one hand, Monica's point about the causality, and also the paper obviously does not make the argument that dictators would be better for stability, and for the sake of stability we should have dictators. But I think Shadi nevertheless raises an important point. I want to give you the opportunity to respond to whether the implications of the conclusions of the report would be to have the United States continue to do what it has been doing for quite some time, which is to invest a lot in the region's dictators.
Sure. Yeah, I guess briefly on the time frame and the kind of limited set of actors. I mean, we were trying to answer a limited question, and we kind of limited we were looking at the kind of current arrangement of power in the Middle East, which basically started with the Arab Spring or a few years before it, right? If we had extended this further back, I think Egypt would have been a more important player, Syria would have been a more important player, and Qatar and the Emirates would have been much less important players. So we wanted to keep it to a specific set of actors in a specific time frame. But I do agree more broadly, yes, I think colonialism and dictatorship has played a huge role in how unstable these states are. I think kind of ironically, a lot of the driving logic of these humanitarian interventions that have been called for now, it's a logic that runs through the Iraq War all the way back to the British and French with their pith helmets, trying to pick winners and losers and choose what the order is going to look like from afar. But yes, and to Shadi's point, when I say do no harm, I don't mean ignore it, cover our eyes and our ears. I mean, like when we support dictatorships, that is an intervention. The military aid we're pouring into Egypt is an intervention. This idea that Obama stepped back from the Middle East, I think is kind of describing a world that didn't happen. Like, yes, Obama eschewed the maximalist option in a lot of cases. In a lot of cases, he didn't send US forces directly into a conflict. But, looking at Yemen, for example, the US greenlit the Saudi intervention, provided all sorts of intelligence and military support, and sold, I think they offered, I forget exactly what the statistic was, but like they offered more in weapons sales than any previous administration to the Saudis. Like that is a blaring green light, and that is an intervention. By proxy, yes, we didn't, send the Marines into Sana'a, but like that's an intervention. And so when we talk about doing no harm, some of that does mean taking stock of what are we supporting right now, and should we continue to support it, or should we impose conditionalities? So I think we agree more than you might necessarily think on a lot of these issues. I think the problem with US foreign policy is that we take it as default setting that some countries just get blank checks and some countries just get unending hostility. And it's kind of a switch you flip between the two, right? So if we were to say no to the Saudis or the Qataris on something, that's taken as like some kind of hostility. And if we were to like trade something with the Iranians, that's taken as like appeasement or realignment, when there's this huge spectrum in between. And I think what this paper is really arguing for is if we're less invested in picking winners and losers in, proxy wars across the region, then we'll actually have more room to maneuver. And I think more room to take a moral stand if we have to.
Thank you so much, Matt. We have questions from the audience that I thought one I wanted to get to right quickly. I want to see if Shadi wanted to react to it, because it really goes to a lot of the things that you've been talking about. And I think this paper actually lends itself to the idea that we need to stop doing some of these things. It's about what's happening in Tunisia right now and what's happening with the reaction of the United States. Secretary Blinken issued a tweet in which he said, I had a conversation with the president of Tunisia about democracy. I think about 7 hours later, he added that he was pushing for respect for democratic institutions, but it was a very different reaction to what we would have seen in other places. So, Shadi, to what extent can we really assume that the guiding star of US foreign policy really is democracy when we see these contradictions, in which it seems to be more so that we divide the region not based on whether they're acting well or not, but whether they are aligned with the United States one way or another?
Yeah. So that's a really important point, and I think this is worth highlighting, that the US is very bad at supporting democracy in the Middle East. In other regions, at least starting in the 1980s and going into the 90s, we improved. Obviously, many listeners will be familiar with our tragic history of supporting coups in Latin America and elsewhere, but some credit where it's due. Eventually, the US started putting pressure on dictators in places like Chile, Brazil, South Korea, Philippines, and so on. The one place where we haven't really had a sustained effort to support democracy is the Middle East, with maybe a partial exception in the Bush administration's freedom agenda in 2004, 2005, and maybe 2 months in 2011 at the start of the Arab Spring, before Obama became disillusioned with the general direction that it was taking. So I think that that is an important part of the story, is that we say that it's a goal, but in practice it hasn't been. What I've been calling for in my own work and research is that we have to find ways to close the gap between American rhetoric on democracy. And it's worth noting that Biden has really brought back an emphasis on using the word democracy, where obviously Trump did not do that. But this makes the gulf between American words and deeds all the more obvious. And I think Tunisia, Trita, as you mentioned, is a good example of where it's a glaring gap. And it reminds me of a very unfortunate period during the Obama administration, where I think, looking back at some of the key critical moments in Egypt during the Arab Spring, that the Obama administration had considerable leverage with which to prevent a coup during crucial days in June and July 2013. But what that would have required was, let's say, an aggressive and even confrontational approach with our Egyptian allies. That does not mean military force or intervention, but it does mean perhaps a full suspension of military aid to Egypt, which is what I was calling for in 2013. In Tunisia, as I have a piece coming out later today where I go into this in some more detail, but I'm also calling for threatening a full suspension of aid to Tunisia unless Tunisia's president quickly reverses course. I would be curious whether that kind of approach, which I think is more associated with interventionists, such as my interventionist quotation marks. I know it's a pejorative, obviously, at least. But I'd be curious whether, Matthew, your paper and your general approach would allow for what some on the left here in the US might perceive as being a little bit too freedom agenda, a little bit too similar to Bush's freedom agenda, this kind of, we believe in democracy and we're going to promote it aggressively, not through military force, but through coercive mechanisms, because ultimately, if you're withholding aid from an ally, that will be perceived as coercive by the governments in question.
Great question, Shadi. I want to give it both to Matt and to Monica, but I've also add another element to it from Professor Gordon Adams in the Q&A, because he points out that when it comes to rebuilding states, perhaps contradicting you there, Shadi, the United States has failed in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Egypt. The track record of the United States is quite clear, being not particularly good at nation building in the Middle East. So why would further engagement actually be particularly helpful? So Matt and Monica, if you guys could both address that issue as well as the question that Shadi put to you. Why don't we start off with Monica?
Sure. So I would love it if the United States could sanction these, autocrats, right? The problem is that it may not be in our interest. And Shadi, you talked about stability. For decades, it was more in our interest to have autocrats who had stable regimes, right? So long as they didn't muck around in the neighborhood. There were exceptions. But the problem is that it's not, the United States, again, is not the sole actor here. And we see what happens with sanctions if we can't get our partners and our allies to go along with it. So the question is could we convince our European allies also to sort of sanction states that are stepping out of line and predating on their populations, but also China and Russia. And I'm not saying that because it can't be done, it shouldn't be tried, but I'm just a little skeptical that that can be done. So the question is, what can we do in the background? I do like the efforts to sort of democracy building, providing sort of outlets for people to be able to get their voices heard. But I say that I'm very concerned in the modern era because autocrats seem to be getting ahead, right? So you think about in Belarus, Venezuela, the Pegasus thing. What's so shocking about that is that you have 50,000 people around the world deployed by program in their cell phones now being tracked and potentially recorded and their data used. And the autocrats are aware of this. So my concern is that it's going to get even more difficult for the United States to sort of help these civil societies to challenge their autocratic regimes. On top of, we have a history where we're supporting those autocratic regimes, so our legitimacy. So we have a lot of work to do, not only individually as a state, to be able to try to bolster these civil society and human rights organizations to challenge these autocratic regimes, but we have to overcome the illegitimacy that we have because we've been hypocritical as to who we're going to do that for. On top of that, layered the technological capacity of these states to be able to survey their populations. And we see it in Iran. You know, you can't go into the Iranian airport. Your computer is taken and your Facebook network is completely taken down, and then those people are called. So I'm really saddened by that. I mean, I'm pessimistic that we're going to be able to do that. And that goes back to my original comment about the United States. Are we reflective enough to recognize those sorts of limitations that we have? And so what I would hope is that we, again, work with partners, you know, European allies and others, and NGO and human rights organizations to really figure out globally, perhaps, how we might be able to do this to undermine these autocrats, because they're coordinating and they're working extraordinarily well to be able to do this.
Thank you, Monica. Matt.
Great. So first, I mean, Shadi said maybe some on the left might perceive withholding aid as too Bush freedom agenda. I please find me a leftist who is against conditioning military aid to these regimes. I mean, we've got to distinguish between sanctions, broad-based sanctions that are designed to damage economies, to mess with currencies and mess with people's livelihoods, and, you know, actively, yeah, when we say coercive measures, like there's like seizing oil tankers, and then there's withholding support. I think these are two different things. And I think, like, yeah, I agree with you, Shadi, that the US should be more judicious in aid, and we should use that as a lever. You know, you brought up Latin America. I think that's actually very illustrative of why the Middle East has been so hard to promote democracy. I mean, when did a bunch of civil wars in Latin America, in Central America, wind down? When did we start pressuring? When did we stop supporting the apartheid government in South Africa and really start pressuring them? When did the Angolan and Mozambican civil wars wind down? Right around the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, because we no longer felt like we had a stake in these proxy wars. We no longer felt threatened to such a large degree by another power. And so we could be less kind of pragmatic and more principled. And, you know, in Latin America, as good as we've gotten at democracy promotion with, I'm not going to get too deep in this because I'm not a Latin Americanist, but I do follow this stuff. With the pink tide and with the rise of governments that were more muscular about challenging US interests, I think we did kind of fall back on supporting authoritarian governments, whether we're talking about the post-coup regime in Honduras or this is recent, so it's controversial, but what happened in Bolivia. But anyways, moving back to the Middle East, I mean, part of the reason why we're so married to autocrats is because we feel very strongly that we have a stake in these proxy wars. And so we think we need all our bastards in our corner to fight the other bastards. But it doesn't really threaten core. We don't have to be like that. It doesn't threaten core US interests. So if we were to, I think, step back and think we don't really have a stake in which dictatorship, you know, wins a lot of these struggles for the region, then we can be more principled and we can say across the board, we don't support autocracy and we'd like to see, you know, more moves towards democratization and real, true long-term stability. That being said, I also think we need to be a little bit humble, as Monica's said, about our ability to democratize regions. I mean, we do have a lot of leverage when it comes to aid. We don't necessarily control these countries, and we do have to be a little bit careful, right? You know, people like to talk about kind of tankies, the people who blame everything on the US and support any US regime, and they kind of have this view of the US as omnipotent, and whenever something bad in the world happens, it's because the US caused it. We got to be careful not to think of, you know, the world as every time something bad happens, it's because the US allowed it.
You know,
Thank you, Matt.
can I just make a very quick
go
point?
ahead.
Yeah, So one thing on how we talk about interventions in response to what Matthew just said is not all interventions are created equal. So besides, I sympathize with that, but I also would be uncomfortable to draw a moral equivalence between Iran's very brutal intervention in Syria, for example, and say Turkey's intervention in Syria. Turkey's intervention in Syria hasn't been good, but Turkey hasn't also backed the mass killings of hundreds of thousands of people. So I think that it would be understandable from a US standpoint to reserve a little bit more ire towards Iran in this particular case, just to give one example.
May I respond to that?
Sure, Matt.
I mean, Turkey has committed ethnic cleansing in Afrin. We can, say that there's different degrees of bad, but like they've been involved for the short time they've been involved. They've unleashed some very horrific things. And I really recommend reading the Treasury designation of Ahrar al-Sharqiya for human rights abuses to see the kind of stuff. I mean, they have established torture prisons. They've executed summarily people. Let's look at Yemen. I'm not saying that, the Iranian intervention in Syria wasn't bad or one of the worst. It was one of the worst things that happened in the region. But I do think to draw on Noam Chomsky a little bit, we have no problem having moral clarity about our enemies, yet we get bogged down in nuance when it comes to our friends. What the Saudis and the Emiratis did in Yemen, I mean, they intervened in a civil war to back a crumbling regime. They committed, bombing against civilian populations, used starvation as a weapon, and then, defends it in terms of, we're defending the internationally recognized government. And look, it does have some, popular support and the rebels are going to massacre people if they win. I mean, what does that sound like to you, right? And hundreds of thousands of people died in the Yemeni conflict and it's not near over. So yes, I do agree. We can say certain interventions are definitely worse than other ones. But I want to push back on this is the point of the paper, is we should, just like we can call out evil when our enemies do it, we should be able to say that what our friends is doing is really bad. And also, we shouldn't have selective moral clarity or selective nuance. We should, I think, approach this across the board. And if you do, I think the heroes and villains story gets a little bit more complicated.
So, Trita, can I just come in?
Yes,
really
yes, but let me just say one thing. We have several people who have asked also about Israel's role, and the paper actually makes it quite clear. Israel is one of the 6 states that is the most interventionist. So after you comment, Monica, I want to have Matt just very quickly address the Israeli role in all of this as well.
No, and it actually is coming out of some of the questions that the audience is asking as well, and responding to these guys, which is, I think one of the issues that we're facing right now and why we're grappling with this and why your report is so important is we don't know why we're in the Middle East right now, right? Now, Israel knows why we're in the Middle East, but do we have the same feeling toward Israel? I'd love to hear Shadi and Matthew on that, but that's what we're facing. So it was really striking to me 20 years ago, the conversation between Matt and Shadi would have been about national interests, right? Like power and power differential and pushing back the Soviet Union. And actually that's 30 years ago, but in any event, and now we've actually fallen onto the human rights interests, which are really important. But of course, as a nation, as a state, we're always trying to balance our national interests. And we do stand for the protection of human rights and individual liberties and freedoms, right? So I think what we're really struggling with right now, and I think what the Biden administration is struggling with, is what are our interests in the Middle East and how should we best defend them? And Israel, of course, is an ally and we want to defend it. But I think that's really the crux of the matter. And a number of the people in the chat box, the Q&A, are asking, why are we in the Middle East?
And before you go into the Israel question, Matt, we had people who have argued in the Q&A, Shadi, and if you could just give your response to it, that how do you convince the American public at a moment when the public, by and large, are sick and tired of being engaged in the Middle East? They're not seeing any of the positive outcomes. And it's, from their analysis, doesn't appear to be because there was too little intervention or the wrong type of intervention. It just doesn't seem to be serving them. So what is your argument to convince that this is actually something that the United States should continue to be, or perhaps even more intensely involved in, that matters in a way that could convince the American public to come to your side?
Sure. So the first thing is I make a very clear distinction between Iraq and Afghanistan on one hand and say the Libya intervention on another. And I think that a lot of our way, the fact that we become so disillusioned in the Middle East, largely originally because of the Iraq war and the experience under the Bush administration. Then we saw how Afghanistan didn't improve and we stayed there for about 20 years. No one, I think, is really calling now for a repeat of those blunders, of large-scale occupations in foreign countries where we're, in some sense, trying to rebuild from scratch and basically trying to be architects of completely new political systems. I didn't call for that in the when I was calling for intervention in Syria in 2012 and 2013. My priority was how do we stop the mass killing and having a credible threat of military force to push Assad to make serious compromises and concessions with the Syrian rebels, with various opposition groups and parties. That's a different kind of intervention than what we did in Iraq in 2003. So when people bring up the failures of Iraq and Afghanistan and say, why are we repeating the mistakes? I actually don't think there are many vocal advocates in DC today who are saying, let's do something comparable to Iraq again. And I think it's also worth noting that I want to be careful not to go into too much detail about Libya. I'm actually, I think, one of the last people who still thinks the NATO intervention in 2011 was, and still in retrospect, what was justified at the time. Because again, if the priority is to prevent mass killing, then that's a different kind of thing than what we saw in Iraq, which was primarily about WMDs. The Iraq war and occupation, they were maybe retroactively justified as being in favor of democracy, but that was not the primary justification that George W. Bush gave. And so that's I think one part of the argument. Now, how to persuade Americans that the Middle East matters and that we should stay engaged in various ways in terms of pressuring regimes to open up their political systems and trying to encourage them to move in that direction. I'd say that what happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. There are spillover effects that come to haunt us eventually, and we can't escape that basic fact. The Syrian civil war, I think, is the number one example of this, where the spillover effects pretty much changed the landscape of Europe, where you have more than 1 million refugees going into various European countries, including primarily Germany, fueling the rise of right-wing populist parties throughout the continent. These are ways that that obviously there are second and third order effects to what happened in Syria that we're going to have to live with for a long time to come. Even in our own domestic politics, Donald Trump made the spillover effects from the Syrian civil war and the rise of ISIS because of the power vacuums in Syria a major focal point of his candidacy. The Muslim ban was largely justified on the basis of what he was pointing to in Syria. We wouldn't have saw that coming in 2012 or 2013.
Thank you, Shadi. I'm going to go to Matt. We have the Israel question, but I do have to, I've been a good boy and kind of stayed out of the conversation, but I do have to push back on one thing you said, Shadi, because you mentioned that, this was just to prevent a genocide in the case of Libya. But earlier on, you also said that the mistake was that we stopped and that there should have been that investment afterwards. And I think that really shows that even if the intention is just to go in and prevent a genocide, which on its face can come across as very simple, certainly justified, but the slippery slope potential of that is immense. And I think that was reflected in your own argument that we shouldn't have just stopped it, we should have done other things. You and I can continue that conversation after, but I do need to make sure, because several people have asked, what about the Israeli angle? The paper does address it. Matt, could you quickly talk about Israel's role in all of this?
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, Israel is kind of a middling power in all of this. They've been quite militarily active around the region for a very long time. They're not as militarily active as Iran, the Emirates, or Turkey, but they're more so than Saudi Arabia and Qatar. A lot of their intervention is in their immediate backyard. You've got the drone strikes in Sinai. You've got the kind of mowing the grass of the war between the wars against the Iranian forces in Syria and now in Iraq. And yeah, you have some support for proxy forces in the region, but it's not as extensive as the Emirati or Turkish or Iranian. I think they're a very small country with limited means at their disposal. I think the bigger Israeli role in this is probably the diplomatic role a lot of the US strategy towards the region is centered around appeasing Israel, making the region safer for them. So that I think, but in terms of direct military intervention, the Israelis are kind of right in the middle. They're not particularly aggressive, but they're not particularly restrained either. And I just wanted to, nobody is advocating for another Iraq war. The Iraq war wasn't built in a day. First we have the 1991 war. We have kind of a limited military action against Iraq, which then turns into a long-term containment and long-term economic sanctions, which fail to unseat the regime. And so as the cost of the containment campaign increase, you have more and more calls to just go in and knock out the regime again. If that doesn't sound familiar to you, the same logic that pervaded the Iraq war. One, that, once we have an enemy, we can't pull back from it. We have to just keep them contained forever. And two, that the instability, once you take out this one last bad guy and the instability will be gone. Those two pieces of logic are still very prevalent in Washington, D.C. And I think a lot of people say that they've learned the lessons of Iraq, but continue to operate. I'm not saying you do, Shadi. I think you're a very nuanced thinker on this stuff, but a lot of people with a lot of power, still seem to be carrying around those lessons and still seem to be, it just takes another 10-year long containment campaign for us to get to the point where just send in the Marines and fix it that way.
An hour flies very fast when you talk about all the problems caused by interventions. We're already at the end of this. I want to thank Matthew, Shadi, and Monica for participating in this conversation. I think one of the key purposes of this paper, except for just laying out what the data actually shows, since no one had done it, was to also help us move away a little bit from this good guy, bad guy type of approach, because it is in and of itself a frame that causes involvement, even when involvement is neither helpful or justified, certainly from the standpoint of US national interest, which I think Monica was quite correct and has oftentimes, if not almost always in the last 10 years, been lost in these conversations. I know there are people who are looking forward to your piece, Shadi, in the Q&A. If you could let us know, where will that piece that you're coming out with later today be published?
Yeah, that'll be in the Atlantic.
In the Atlantic. Excellent. Again, thank you all so much. This was a fantastic conversation. I hope we have the opportunity to call you back in further conversations on this as well as on other topics. For all of you who have been watching, thank you so much for participating in this conversation. If you are already not on the QI, the Quincy Institute's mailing list, please go to quincyinstitute.org, sign up for our emails, and that way you will get not only all the invitations to our webinars and other events, but also to all of the papers and reports that are produced by our research staff.